Good evening, YouTube. Tire Metalhead Weatherman here. Hopefully, you guys are doing well today. So, severe weather threat is upcoming starting tomorrow, and we have more model data available to us. So, we're going to be mainly talking about that tonight. As of right now, not a whole lot's changed with the wintry side of things. So, this is strictly going to be severe weather. So, just letting you know in advance, if the video doesn't apply to you, then you can disregard if you want. But that being said, nothing has changed with the risk level. Both Wednesday and Thursday remain a slight risk. Pretty robust tornado threat on Wednesday's threat, particularly, especially as we get into the late evening and overnight hours. I do see potential for this area to be stretched a little further to the south, however. But the main threat with these, really, it's all three hazard types are possible in equal amounts. And this will start to carry over into day 3, where we have a probabilistic outlook for severe weather that exists all across, really from the Great Lakes down towards the Gulf Coast. This area that's further off to the east, that was Atlanta, that was originally in the slight risk. It's been downgraded to a marginal risk as we go on throughout the day Thursday. It's not really going to be a high cape event, so this could limit some of the activity to the south here. The dynamics just aren't as good as what we were looking at maybe a couple of days ago. So that's one relief to be had here. Same can be said across this central Tennessee area and the Ohio Valley. So this could be a little bit more limited threat, possibly. I'm hoping that remains to be the case. I don't see any reason as to why this would upgrade now, thankfully, whereas before I wasn't seeing much reason as to why this downtrended. Thankfully, it did, because it would have been a very gnarly outbreak to have in February. So now that we've established that, let's go ahead and look at some model data here. So we already know when the storm system's arriving, and with that being said, do things a little bit differently here. See if I can do something more efficient. So this is the time frame where we start to see this next trough coming into play. This is about maybe 10-11 a.m. Central Time across this region here, and we can see some energy is apparent here, but there's also a capping inversion in place, and this capping inversion is going to limit storm activity through the afternoon, which would be peak time, and this would be when we would see the worst conditions possible if these storms were to have broken through the cap. Fortunately, though, that doesn't seem to be the case here. We could watch for a little bit of activity over here towards this region, but for the most part, I think it's going to be pretty limited. Move this a couple of frames all the way up to the 30th hour here, which is going to be the OOZ run. We'll start making our comparisons here. We'll start out with the Euro. Pretty much a similar look all across the board, really, to be honest with you, on really all the models. This is the Euro. This is the Canadian. Oops, I clicked the wrong button. Canadian. Here's the GFS, though, right here. Not too much different. So we're getting some model agreement here. But the main things to be looking at are going to be the discrepancies between, I'd say, the low-level jet and I'd say the warm sector, the moist sector, because the NAM and the NAM is showing something different in comparison to the global models here. So let's go ahead and actually take a look at that. We'll start out with the low-level jet. So we're looking about a couple miles above the above our heads in the low levels of the atmosphere, of course. And this is the time frame we're going to start out at. There is a little bit of a jet streak that tries to pop up here starting out across this region. And we're just going to move this a couple of frames. We're going to move this to 30 hours out. And we can see a pretty solid jet streak starts to develop across Texas. And this is an area that is due for concern, because this area is where we're expecting potentially a cap to start breaking here. And then this piece of energy is going to move off to this jet streak is going to move off to the east as time goes on. So we'll move this about maybe 1 or 2 more scans here, and look what we have here. This is on the NAM. We have a little jet streak here where we're getting up to about 50 knots. And then across Arkansas, Louisiana, we got widespread areas where we're looking at about 40 knots. And this is prevalent on all the global models as well, and the HRRR, since we're in range of that at this point now. We have a widespread area where we're getting up to about 40 knots, getting into the upper 40s in some spots. Then, of course, there's the GFS. Slightly stronger solution and leads to maybe an earlier window developing across maybe even parts of western Mississippi overnight. But for the most part, could be some dangerous conditions overnight across these regions here. We'll go ahead and jump this a couple more scans here. We'll go all the way up to 06Z, and you can see here another pocket where we're getting up to about 50 knots plus is usually a red flag. By this point, the cap will have broken over these areas, so these storms will be able to flourish. That being said, you can look at the regional and convective models. We're seeing some pretty strong returns now with the low-level jet, and really all across the board. Even the global models are picking up on it at this point, so this is definitely something that we're going to have to be extremely watchful of in the overnight hours. Fortunately, with the setup being as it is here, I'm probably not going to be able to live stream that, so anyone that might have been potentially looking forward to that, I'm sorry, just timing is bad, because more than likely I'll still end up having to work the following day, and that would be a disaster. So that being said, that's a look at the low-level jet. Low-level jet's pretty impressive as we head into Thursday too. So we'll jump this all the way up to 18Z. It's pretty strong, especially in these regions further up to the north. But if we look at a sounding here, though, really the main dynamic that we have here is a low-level jet. When we look at the storm relative felicity here, there's not really much to be had. Look at that, 18 meters squared per second square. No real stretched out curve of the hordeograph that kind of leans towards a tornado threat of any kind. Well, actually, there is a little something, but they're very loose matches, though. There could be a marginal severe threat here, but I'm not really expecting a whole lot to come of this. We'll have to see how things develop with this, because this could be leaning towards maybe leaning slightly towards a cold core setup. The moisture return is the main key with that. Moisture return in the low-level jet. Will those two dynamics be enough to where we can overcome the lack of instability we have here? Because our CAPE is 11 joules per kilogram. I've said usually you look at least 500. We're not even close to that. And this is where the jet streak is going to be strongest starting out. We'll jump this 2 more scans up to OOZ. By this point, a lot of the jet streak will be moving off to the east into further unfavorable conditions. We may have to watch over towards the southeast for one more pocket of maybe marginal tornado threat, severe storms. And you can see that here, actually. Cape's a little bit better in this region. Environment's a little bit more conducive. Very strong low-level helicity. Very good curve in the hordeograph. So this is going to be something that needs to be watched pretty closely. As far as the sounding analogs, there's not a whole lot of matches there, so that's one comfort to be had here, but there is the chance of that being a supercell as well, or there's a chance of a supercell popping up in that environment there, so we'll just have to watch that with bated breath as we head into the evening hours across the southeast. But of course, as we know, towards Friday, especially into the overnight hours of Thursday, worse the weather will be out of here. Take a sounding over Atlanta. Severe threat at this point, pretty much non-existent. Could be a small change. Oh, actually, hang on a minute. Sounding analogs are loose, but there is a little bit of a tornado threat. There's a decent little curve here. Nothing to really be super concerned with, but I'm going to, of course, keep an eye on it still. There is a marginal risk that exists through there. And pretty much it's the same song across all of the models that we have available to us here. So the next thing to look at is the moisture return. And one thing I'm starting to also notice is that I'm seeing a lot more model agreement than I have in the last couple of days. That's what's made this really hard to forecast. This is why we haven't seen any area that has an increased enhanced risk or anything like that. is because Euro and the GFS are showing something different. Once we got in range of the NAM, it was showing something different. NAM 3 kilometers shows something a little different too. So it's hard when it gets like that. It's very hard to nail anything down and make an update to the forecast with high confidence. Whenever we have several different outcomes, because you never know which one's going to be right. That being said, though, we're going to jump on back to Wednesday, early Wednesday afternoon, late Wednesday morning. And all across the board, we can already start to see that moisture return coming in. We see here is our moist sector for Wednesday. We pretty much know what's going on with that now. Pretty much anywhere across from this region here is our moist sector. This is where we're getting our moisture returns at this time. And we'll see this area start to stretch out more as we go into the next couple of frames here. Go one more. Oops. Got to clear that off. But now look, we're starting to stretch a little bit further to the north. This is where we start getting Arkansas in play. This is where we get a large chunk of Louisiana, coastal Texas especially, and then eventually we get into Mississippi here. And all across the board, it's pretty much the same story. Very rich dew points, very moisture-rich environment. And this extends all the way through, even into Alabama and Georgia, so this is something to keep an eye on over there. So if we move this forward, I'd say to about maybe an extra 6 hours, we'll see that those dew points are holding pretty strong across the region at this point. Our dry line is going to end up being right here. So this is more than likely where our front's going to end up being at, right across this area here. Because you can see the contrast where we have those 60-degree dew points, and then we get into those 30-degree dew points. Oops. So that being said, go ahead and move this up to about 48 hours out. It's the last HRRR run that we'll get here. And look what happens when we get towards the afternoon hours across the southeast. Look at how far north that moisture is going. Realistically, in a minimal situation for severe weather, you want dew points around about 55. I'd say 55 is would be right about here. And this is getting into Indiana and Ohio here. So a large portion of the southeast has sufficient dew points. The temperatures are a little bit of a question mark the further north we go. And Cape is a big issue here because there's just not a lot of convective energy available with this system. That being said, we can still overcome that given the other parameters we have available. So if we run across the board here, we see the Canadian and the Euro with moisture returns extending much further north. GFS is the same, and now we have the HRRR in the game showing the same thing. Well, finally, it looks like we actually now have the NAM on board with this too now. Whereas before we were kind of a little bit more cut off on this moist sector here. So a lot of moving around here. Oh, hey, we got the blend of models in here too. So everything across the board now is a little bit more in line. So there is some increased confidence here that we'll have severe weather. If there's going to be an enhanced risk, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I'm thinking maybe northern Alabama and Mississippi, but like I said, the Cape is limited, so it doesn't give me a lot of confidence there, you know what I'm saying? So we're just going to have to play it by ear and see what happens. Of course, now when we go to 54 hours out, that's when we'll see our moist sector is actually persisting now. This is my first time seeing some of these runs. I saw the GFS, the Euro, and a few others. But in recent trends all the way up until 18Z, I wasn't really seeing too much in the way of moisture by this time. So that being said, to see this is a little bit more interesting. So we'll have to see what happens on Thursday. Again, the Cape is relatively limited with this. So it's going to be hard to really hone in on anything and say, okay, this is definitely going to happen across such and such region. So it's tricky. That's pretty much been the story of this entire forecast here. This moist sector does persist into the overnight, but I do think the severe threat's going to be a little bit further to the east than what we're seeing here too, though. So it's going to be tricky, going to be a lengthy forecast for sure. Of course, we know by Friday morning, Friday afternoon, the worst of the weather will be out of here. Main thing we're going to be looking now is for the warm sector itself, and then of course we'll take a look at the Cape parameters and so on and so forth, and we'll be out of here. So here's our warm sector developing on Wednesday afternoon. It's a pretty large warm sector right here, I'd say. It starts out mainly across this region right here. Even Alabama's getting into the action here. Some showers and storms are possible in between this area too. So that's where you see these little blotches, like right here, for example. You could see some activity probably possible across there. So one thing to note as we go through all of the models here, warm sector is pretty abundant. Some models, of course, will have it a little bit stronger than others. That's the Euro right there. It's a Canadian. It's a GFS. GFS definitely has the strongest warm sector I've seen throughout the entire time that we've been viewing or analyzing this, the pre-event threat, so to speak. It's the HRRR, my first really good look at it, and we can see that there's a pretty strong warm sector, especially towards coastal Texas. I don't know if I'm not sure. I don't want to necessarily jump the gun here, but I got a feeling that if there's gonna be something that pops up here in the later half of Wednesday, it's gonna be across this region right here, somewhere around this corridor. If there's gonna be an enhanced risk, I think it's gonna be somewhere around here. Particularly, I would say maybe across this corridor here. Maybe here? I don't know. We'll see what happens. We'll see what the Storm Prediction Center does with that. But that's all the models that I have at this time. Let's go ahead and jump this to OOZ. And we'll see a distinct difference here between the models, or I thought I would. I'm not sure now because everything seems so different. So looking at the NAM first, we're gonna see warm sector still persistent. I really don't think we start seeing a lot more movement until the overnight hours. We can move this over to the HRRR. It's a pretty similar look. A little bit warmer with some of the other models here. GFS kind of cools down a little faster than some of the others. The Canadians actually a bit warmer, which I find interesting. I haven't seen that trend out of there for a while. It's a nice little sector here where we get up to the 80s here. So that's a little bit alarming, but also that could help keep that cap healthy, and that cap could limit storm development too. So a lot of moving parts with this setup here. A lot of moving parts. And for some of these areas, the cap, not necessarily the cap, but the warm sector doesn't start to make it a little further north until later into the evening. Because if you remember that slight risk area, we see parts of, we even see parts of, I'm actually going to mark it here just to help myself along, but small portions of Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee involved in here too. I don't think it's till later where that warm air starts to advect far enough north to reach this area. So this warm sector still builds as we're heading into the overnight here. So we're going to actually jump this all the way up to 36 hours out, which would be 06Z. And by this point, it does reach a little further north, but it starts to lose a little bit more oomph here further to the south. I think a few storms will have gone through there at this point. What type of mode we'll be looking at is going to be a key factor. I'll probably try to make a video in the morning to cover that. So that being said, all across the board, it looks pretty identical at this point now. So there's a little bit more confidence during the overnight hours where there's going to be more of an organized severe threat, especially through Arkansas and parts of Kentucky, Tennessee, and maybe even a little bit of Missouri. So that being said, we'll go ahead and jump this now up to 48 hours out. Start to make our comparisons there. Again, pretty abundant warm sector that pops up here across Alabama. We'll go ahead and actually take a sounding of this really quickly. And you can see here that the Cape value isn't impressive. Again, we're at only 210 joules per kilogram, but low level helicity very strong here, 168 meters squared per second squared. Notable curve in the hordeograph here. Classic supercell indicator right there. 14 loose matches of maybe tornado threat here, so it's a mess, but we're gonna have to figure this out. Tornado threat can't be ruled out Thursday, but I'm thinking the further along in the day we get, I think this could very well decrease unless we see an uptick around this time frame. And this is valid for pretty much all of the models here. I think the global models are a little bit hotter on the temperature, so we could end up seeing a much different scenario here. Cape value still is low, so it's going to be a low Cape event regardless, but we're also seeing a major uptick in hail activity possibly, because you see these low to mid-level lapse rates here, as we can see on this sounding. So that's going to be something to keep a close eye on too. It's a lot to keep up with on this one. But pretty much all across the board, severe threat is still pretty valid heading into Thursday. One more thing to look at here. We'll go ahead and go to OOZ, and then we'll probably start to look at the final results here. Start to look at the cap, and then, of course, the precip. So here is OOZ. Here's all our models. Still a warm sector exists, but for the most part, I think the dynamics are going to be getting away from us. But we can also see our cold front here, but even a little further out ahead of it, it's not a huge disparity here, which also kind of limits the potency that we have here too. We see surface temperatures heading down into the 50s past the front, over back towards Mississippi, but head of the front in areas like Atlanta, for example, we're only getting up to about the mid 60s. So that's about what, a 10-degree temperature contrast. Not very broad, so it's not a huge difference, and as a result, it will most likely help limit some of the severe threat here. When you have a dynamic storm system, you can see very abrupt temperature drops between the fronts here. Like if you were to look back earlier when I put this up, let's say we were looking at maybe about what? Back to about maybe, let's say OZ here. Distinct difference here. This is our warm sector right here. We're seeing 30s and 20s over here, so very key point to be made there. Very keen difference, I should say. By the time we get to Friday, worst of the weather's out of here. So now, only things left to really look at are our Cape values and our CIN, or capping inversion. So the Cape doesn't really start to pick up, and this is one of the key factors for our event. It doesn't really pick up until later in the afternoon, and it does actually look impressive on Wednesday. Thursday is a different story, but Wednesday is has me a little bit more concerned. So the euro, first off, let me state I'm looking at the mixed layer I'm looking at the mixed layer, and the GFS does not have a mixed layer setting. They only have surface base, which is kind of irritating. But we still have the euro, and we still have our short range models. So this is 30 hours out. You can see here we have Cape values heading over 2,000 at this point. So that's a red flag right here, and that's what makes me think that there's still a chance for an enhanced risk, while at the same time there's still a few things that I'm a little bit uncertain about. You can see the curve in the hordeograph here. You can see the temperature and the dew points are very rich. So you can see the storm relative helicity. But right here, looks like we still see a little piece of a capping inversion. Oh, let me see if I got this right. I'm trying to change the color here. There we go. But see right here where I did this circle on the sounding analog, it looks like a capping inversion exists right here. And this is going to definitely limit things across this region. So that's another key factor in all of this, is the capping inversion. How strong will it be around this time of night? Because this could be the key difference between this being a massive severe weather event or being a relatively minute one. But pretty strong cape across the board. The euro is definitely looking like it's the strongest. But when we look at the HRRR, it's no slouch either. We still see pockets where we're getting above 2,000. We're getting above 1,500 joules as well. So this is not by any means a slouch, and this is pretty widespread too. So with that cape, or with the cape and maybe the potential of a cap holding out and maybe holes being poked in it, tornado potential still seems like it's very much high, I would say. Okay, so let's move this all the way up to 06Z. And we still have that pocket of intense cape right here across Texas and Louisiana. I have some pretty strong cape that's developed around Arkansas, heading into those same areas that I was talking about: Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri. And we'll see this also start to progress into Mississippi. As we roll this forward, we can see the same look on the HRRR. The NAM shows ridiculous cape too. Oh wait, now that's back to the euro. I don't know why I jumped back to that. But really, all four of the models, even the short range here, has another little setup here. Here's another area where we're sitting at about 2,000 joules per kilogram. Cape is there, 1831. Problem is, again, cap value. One other thing to watch here, of course, like I said before, lapse rates. So, but this little surface interference right here could be a key factor in maybe limiting the tornado threat. We'll have to see what happens. So, it's going to be a tricky forecast. It's going to definitely be what we call a nowcast situation for sure. So, we're going to jump all the way up to Thursday now. Notice the distinct difference in cape value. HRRR is honestly a little bit more generous with the cape, or a little bit more intense with the cape. Actually, so is the 3 kilometer. So there is something that we'll have to watch here. But I do think these storms will end up being more so along a boundary, I would say. These are going to be more linear in nature, but there's going to be enough cape to support them for a period of time, I would say. I think these could be very cyclic. We'll see what happens with that. And then when we get to OOZ, that's when we'll start to see things start to die down tremendously. So now we're down to only 3 models that we have available. And you can see here, not a whole lot to work with. Oops. I meant to keep that at, there we go. But yeah, you can see here, not a whole lot to work with. 3 kilometer has the highest cape value, but even then, only a couple of pockets where we could see up to about 1,000 joules. Again, maybe if there was to be an enhanced risk, it would be here, but the other factors just don't really point that out. Again, there's still time for this to change in either direction, and it's going to be hard to say which direction it will go. So we're going to have to just keep an eye on it and hope for the best here. But that being said, the last thing we're going to look at here is our mixed layer, and then we're going to look at the precip, of course. We're just going to stick with the euro and go on loop with that, or maybe the NAM. But one thing to note here is the main thing we're going to be looking at as far as our capping inversion is concerned is going to be across this region. The brighter the colors, basically, the stronger the cap will be. So we're going to run this across the board here, all the way up to about 30 hours out. Cape's pretty strong across Texas, and that's the main area that I've been interested in But right across this region, look how it slowly will begin to weaken, just a tiny bit. It's still pretty strong when you start to see the negative values here. But where we start to see that limit, that begin to be limited. See, notice how it has the marginal tornado threat, but you see this little feature right here, like I mentioned earlier. That is our cap. And the lower it is to the surface where we have that warm air loft, the harder it's going to be for the storms to blossom and develop into supercells. So the perfect example of a capping inversion, and really all the models are have been picking up on this over the last couple of days, I would say. So the thing with this is going to be, will the cap break over Texas by late evening or early evening hours? Because that could really change the game. So we watched this messy setup here begin to work its way eastward. By this point, the cap becomes a lot less relevant here. The forcing of the storm system kind of takes over a bit to an extent. And then there's a little bit more dynamics available to kind of keep things moving along, as the front really will start to take over, especially too. And this will end up starting to become more irrelevant over a small portion of maybe, I would say, Mississippi. We could see a little bit of a capping inversion develop here. And you kind of see it on here, but as I said before, it's more likely to break because the low-level jet in the overnight hours drops down in altitude and ends up moving some of that warm air around, in other words. So again, we're just going to have to see how this plays out. A lot of question marks with this setup. It's making for a very long video, I know, and I apologize. But that's what we have going on there. And of course, like I said before, Cape values, the capping inversion becomes a little bit more relevant by tomorrow afternoon. Look at that. See? It's where our storms will start to develop. Look how weak the cape gets, the cap value gets by then. The capping inversion gets by then. Sorry if I just bumped the mic. So that being said, we know what we're dealing with now. Let's go ahead and finally take a look at what our precip could look like. So here we are looking at the NAM, a little bit of a different view, a little less defined than the some of the convective models or the Euro high res, but we'll still see what we need to see here. We start to see activity form up late into the overnight hours with this run. A little different than what the Euro is showing. I think these storms could fire a little earlier than this. I think this is my personal opinion, though, more or less. You see the storm start to fire across Mississippi, Louisiana, and parts of Arkansas, and then transgress off towards Alabama by the afternoon hours. This also has this lagging back a little bit more, which I find interesting too. But like I said, there's been a lot of discrepancy between models, so this outcome I wouldn't say really should be paid attention to. Really, you can honestly throw all three of the global models and the short range models out the window, honestly. If we look, and the funniest part is the NAM 3 kilometer is heavily based off the NAM itself, but when we look at the NAM 3 kilometer, which is what I like to use more, watch this. Alright, so here we are. You can see much more activity already starting to develop by 03, 04Z. By 06Z, we can probably see a couple of supercells maybe popping up here. Could be a little bit on the messy side given the convection that we have available too, so it's going to be hard to hone in on that. But watch what happens as we move this further along throughout the day. Small line develops here where that cape is going to be the most rich, and we could see damaging winds and tornadoes from this squall line, maybe even bow echo if you want to call it that, ends up coming through the southeast, eventually through Georgia, and then by Friday morning it's about out of here at this point, falling apart. So yeah, this is a perfect example of just what the heck is going on with the forecast models here. When you have this kind of situation, it can be a little bit frustrating, I'm not gonna lie, but hey, that's part of the game. That being said, I know this was a lengthy one. I apologize for that, but that's just what we have going on with this setup here. Wanted to inform you the best way that I can, and also in the most honest way I could. That being said, hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it useful, you know what to do. Drop a like. Always appreciate that. Subscribe if you haven't already. We may not get the 300 subs for the 1-year anniversary of the first video here, but 250 wouldn't be bad either. I'll take that. Only 4 away. So if you could share the video, of course, and help us get out there, always appreciate that. But we'll have a video up in the morning, especially if there's any major updates. If not, then we'll just take a look at the composite and see what happens there. But until then, this has been Tyre, Metalhead Weatherman. You guys have a good night, and I'll see you soon.